Stay tuned for Butler on Business, coming up next on the Liberty Express.
Mr., mind you, Don Watkins, number 2 fellow up there at the Ayn Rand Institute, author, along with his buddy, Yaron Brooke, of Free Market Revolution, How Ayn Rand's Ideas Can End Big Government. Damn, don't we need to end the big government. Don, how you doing?
Great. Good to talk to you again.
Well, it's good talking to you. Let's talk about this book.
I mean, we're covering the general trend of government getting bigger, but I mean, we're tackling the specifics too. We're tackling the financial crisis, the healthcare crisis, the entitlement crisis, overregulation. Every aspect of the economy we're looking into and showing how government is actually making our lives worse and how we could move in a freer direction if we really took seriously Ayn Rand's lesson for us.
So government is not the solution to our problems. Government is the problem.
Well, good government is a solution. If you had the kind of government the founders set up for us, one that protected our freedom, that is a solution. That's a great thing. But the problem is today, and government is the problem today, because instead of protecting our freedom, almost its primary role is to interfere with that freedom, and that is a disaster.
Why, chapter 2 here, I do have a copy in the interest of fair disclosure. Why does government just always continue to grow? I know Thomas Jefferson warned us that would happen.
Well, the basic issue is what is the foundation of a free society is one basic moral principle, and that is that each individual has a right to exist for his own sake. Once you throw that out and say, no, sometimes the collective gets to interfere, gets to trump his freedom, gets to dictate how he spends his life, what kind of choices he makes, what happens to the wealth that he earns. Once you establish that principle, then you get a process of more and more government. And so the whole issue in terms of defending more freedom is getting back to that idea the individual is sovereign, not the collective, not the group, not the state.
I'll tell you how bad it is. I had mentioned this when we came onto the show. I'd gotten a request to interview some professor up at the University of Pittsburgh, and they wanting to raise money for a fund to teach the students how they can invest with the collective good in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And the key thing to understand is this is how individualism is always attacked, and we're seeing it today all around us, is they completely distort what it is. They treat individualism as this kind of atomistic, you don't deal with other people, you don't benefit from other people. Individualism means that each person is able to exist for his own sake and cooperate with others voluntarily. Collectivism is not the idea of cooperation. It's the idea of the group gets to trump the individual. It gets to dictate what he does. And instead of voluntary cooperation, it's involuntary coercion. And that's what we have to reject.
Don, you also outlined that the last swing to the right failed. Now, we touched on that briefly last week, but could you elaborate on that theme?
Yeah, I'm so glad you raised this. Anytime you're trying to figure out what's going to happen today, it's helpful to look at the past. And, of course, we saw at the end of the 70s and early 80s what was called the swing to the right, which is Americans saw we're going in a really bad direction and we need to take a step back. And that's when we got Prop 13 in California, we got Reagan, we got a rollback of some regulations, of some taxes. But it failed because it was kind of an emergency response. It was, wow, things are out of control, let's take a step back. It wasn't a moral, ideological rejection of big government. It wasn't an idea of, no, we should head in the direction of capitalism because the individual has a right to live freely. It was, in effect, just kind of, well, let's make collectivism a little less disastrous. And it worked for a time, but in the long run, you have to take a real ideological stand.
I would agree with that position. I also would assert that the two parties, as they are currently constituted, disagree only around the margins. That, for the most part, they are both for big government. And maybe I've gotten cynical in my older years, but it looks to me like really the only thing that separates them is 3 basis points on the top marginal tax rate, whether or not those TSA gate rapers should have been unionized or not, And at what rate are they going to grow the government? Are they going to grow it 50% in 6 years like the Republicans did? Or are they going to grow it in 3 years, 50% like the Democrats did? That seems to me to be really the only distinction.
In terms of the parties, I think, sadly, you're right. But in terms of the American people, I don't think that's true. I think the American people are better than their intellectual leadership, and they're better than their political leadership. Now, we're still getting the political leadership we want. It's not that Americans are walking around demanding laissez-faire capitalism and the politicians aren't listening. But the point is that I think Americans, unlike the people in Washington, are open to new ideas. They're open to new arguments. And what they just need to hear is they need to hear the case made right. They need to hear the case proven, and they need to see people defend it with self-confidence instead of, for instance, a person who ran a private equity firm unable to defend private equity.
In other words, the American people are smarter and better than their leaders.
Absolutely. And what they need, though, is they need leadership. But above all, what they need is intellectual leadership, people who can explain what capitalism is, why it's the solution to our problems, and why it's a profoundly moral and noble system as opposed to the mess we have today.
And you can find that by getting a hold of Free Market Revolution, How Ayn Rand's Ideas Can End Big Government, the Ayn Rand Institute. Don, buddy, we're out of time.
Always a pleasure.
Hey, I always enjoy talking to you.